Hello, Michael.
Andre, I was thinking, we used to go on these long drives upstate and have long conversations where I was concentrating on the road and listening to you at the same time.
I can yak. Yeah, it's my specialty. No, this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss a book that is seldom discussed in the US and that has not had a long life here. I mean, it's available, we know it as The Betrothed, and I don't know, the Betrothed means one person in English? In Italian?
I think it's indeterminate, really.
Yeah, it is, yeah. So it has no specific gender. Because I always think that The Betrothed reflects a woman as opposed to Promessi Sposi. But nevertheless, this is a book that has been basically has fashioned the Italian language, especially when it comes to prose. And maybe you can give us a very sort of summary approach to why is it a book that doesn't disappear? Why is it a book that every Italian knows in one way or another, or claims to know? Because today nobody reads any longer.
I mean, well, it doesn't disappear in Italy. One reason is it is a required reading in schools.
Because they read the whole thing?
Yes.
They do.
Yes.
And they memorize long passages.
Okay.
You know, and then they have what is called the interrogazione, a sort of oral quiz in front of the class to see whether you've actually memorized the footnotes as well. You know, but I also think that it's very memorable. I think for the characters that he creates, for the sort of enchantment actor that he weaves through language. I think he's one of the great stylists of the Italian language.
And yes, he's a stylist, there's no doubt, and I've discovered it because I've read it again this earlier this summer. I made a point of rereading it because whatever, I had to. And I found out that, he's also very funny, extremely funny. You want to discuss that for a moment?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of irony in the way that he presents things. I mean, he's telling a story. He's telling you that he's telling a story, and he's ironizing the different characters. And he'll paint a character just like Dickens, I think, in a way. I compare him to Dickens, and just 2 or 3 brushstrokes, I sort of like to say. But he's constantly, on the one hand, he is denouncing the state of injustice. On the other hand, he's sort of making fun of the rulers at the same time.
Making fun of the rulers. How about other people who he's supposed to respect somehow and doesn't really?
Well, there's Donna Placide is one of the great characters who wishes to save Lucia's soul. She's convinced that Lucia has fallen into the hands of the wrong guy, so he has great fun with her. And her husband, with his famous library, going through all of these tomes from the 17th century and earlier of witchcraft and astrology that he's convinced are the best science.
But there's how many of you think that he has a lot of humor? Because I think that the thing that drew me to him again for the last time was exactly the humor. The fact that, this guy is an ironist, but a very accomplished one, which is something I never noticed before.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much covered. He's become such an icon, and such that the Italians have sort of lost sight of that themselves. I mean, he's been shoved down their throats.
Okay.
To put it bluntly, And then portraits that you see of him are of this very severe man.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about the severity? Because when I was taught, when I was in high school, he was taught to me, and the most important thing that everybody mentioned is his conversion, which I found very boring. First of all, because I don't believe in conversions. And I think the teacher did believe in it. So he basically was propounding this idea of this man who had a Calvinist background or who developed one and through his wife, etc. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Sure. Well, first of all, conversion is very much at the root of Italian literature. 2 of the great poets of the 14th century, Dante is about conversion, and Petrarch is about conversion. So you have these conversion stories in Italian literature. In his case, though, I think they don't even, it's a good story, first of all, the story of his conversion. That it was during the marriage of Napoleon and, not Josephine, but...
Marie?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the crowds were going crazy, fireworks were going off, and Manzoni was afraid of crowds. So he ran into the Church of St. Paul's, and he prayed to God, to Jesus, or to the Holy Spirit, you choose. that if he found his wife again, then he would be killed. And they do have a stone in the Church of St. Rod saying this is where Manzoni converted. But I think the conversion isn't so much religious as it is literary. You know, he was sort of moving away from the tradition of 18th century mythology. Neoclassicism lasted much longer than it should. Italy tended to be a little bit behind the curve on European developments. So I think, and he'd been writing these poems, which I'm not fond of his poetry, I'll be honest. And I think so he turned more to Italian history, I think, at that point, with these two tragedies that he wrote about the Lombards and about conflicts between Italy and various conquering armies and stuff. So I see the conversion in those terms, but there is, you know, a religious turn in his writing.
Yes, there is. I've been taught that. Except I don't gobble it down. It just goes down very difficult. Because his book, however, although there is a vow and there is lots of admonitions as well, but there's a sense that he's having far more fun in this novel than a book that is maintained. So that assumes that it is about a conversion, or his own conversion. Now that's what he's writing. How do you accommodate? I've never been able to accommodate humor with high seriousness. And I think the only way to do that is through irony, which he's basically a champion.
Well, I just find in my own experience, if I try to write something serious, it ends up being funny. If I try to write something funny, it ends up being serious. So I do see them, you know, as two sides of the same coin, you know. And I think that Manzoni has a great sense of balance. Like, he never wanted to go too far. So, you know, when he gets into a serious passage, a long sermon, for example, this long scene between, you know, the Archbishop, Cardinal Borromeo, who's chewing out the local priest who did not marry. Don't want to give away too much of the plot. But,
because they don't know, right?
They don't know. But, you know, and, you know, he starts chewing out this you know, poor parish priest for not doing his duty and not being willing to be a martyr, you know. And all the while that he's preaching, you know, the local priest is saying, easy for you to say, you weren't looking at those two ugly faces, you weren't staring death in the face. So, you know, this is how he does it.
Yeah, he does it, and he does it very, very well. I think we spoke on the phone, and I said that my favorite character is the least attractive one, which is, of course, Don Abbondio, who is really complex, because even after the plague is gone away, or whatever, not entirely abated, but it's on its way out, he becomes again the very person he was at the very beginning of the book. So it just confirms something that I've always believed in, that people never change, and characters don't change. And you will find this in life, totally true. But in essence, he's been yelled at by Cardinal Borromeo, been put in his place, been threatened by the Cardinal, and yet here he is back to doing exactly the same thing. He doesn't want to marry them.
Yeah, 700 pages later, he's still looking for excuses. And he hasn't run out of them, you know.
Yeah, but he's very good. I find it very attractive because he's a comic character that if you had to depict him, I haven't seen the film, and there have been, I'm sure.
Yeah, 3 or 4, but
yeah.
I had Alberto Sordi, the young actor, portrayed him in one of the last versions.
No, that's exactly the kind of person you want. Well, we discussed slightly the history of, the history of the conversion, which, as I said, I don't exactly buy, because I don't understand it. I don't understand conversions. I can understand if you're pious to begin with and you continue being pious, that's one thing. But if you're not pious and you convert, that I don't get. However, that's me, okay?
But one thing I would add, though, about that, I think that Manzoni felt compelled to defend the Catholic Church against certain historians.
Oh.
Like someone can remind me of his name, Sismondi's is one of the great Italian historians who, claimed that the Roman Catholic Church had held Italy back. And Manzoni instead argued the opposite. I think maybe in the 18th century, the way he sort of straddles the 18th and the 19th centuries is interesting, because he's very much a man of that period, in that whole transformation that we see in the French Revolution even. So I think he just sort of felt that no, the church had an enlightening influence and argued for especially in this book, pointing out not the role of the church so much, but certainly the role of Confucian monks.
Yeah, okay. And especially, okay, yes, the monks are important. Do you want to discuss the monks? Fine, okay, let's leave the monks alone. No, because, you know, he's a great character.
I mean, there's a lot to say about monks.
Yeah.
There's a lot of monks, too.
Yeah.
I am always worried about talking about monks because I was once reprimanded by my dissertation advisor for calling someone a monk when he was actually a friar. So.
Okay. No, because I'm thinking of, essentially, everybody learns a book by heart. The book has been there for almost 200 years. And now we're back again with a new translation that essentially reintroduces to the American public a novel that has kind of disappeared. Okay? And it was not well translated before. And so now we have a new translation. So talk to us a bit about the translation itself.
I think one of the reasons I undertook it in the first place, there were many arguments among Italianists about why this book isn't better known, why it hasn't done, well abroad. And some were saying it's too Catholic, it's too Italian, it's too this. And my response was very simple: no, it's just not translated very well. It didn't have the lyricism of his language, it didn't have the humor, it didn't have the dialogue, and it didn't have mostly, I think, the dynamism. I mean, from the very beginning, I feel in these long novels that came out of the 19th century, they were dynamic. They moved forward. This was published episodically, but not in the same sense that Dickens was.
Right.
And there were little cliffhangers here and there to keep you going.
Yes.
So to talk about the translation, I mean, I was translating, retranslating myself, revising, constantly sort of changing my mind about things. And even now, if I were to redo it, I might do it differently. I was trying to strike a balance between, first of all, I wanted to be modern, and I wanted to be respectful of Manzoni. Too many times the translations of the classics are just sort of fossilizing and using beautiful, decorous language. And you can even think of some recent translations like that, which are beautiful to see, but I think that they, again, sort of embalm the book rather than, making it alive. So I sort of stuck to his style of syntax. I used words that were not too modern, but not too old. One of the words, it comes up, he uses these words when he's talking about villains. He talks about scoundrels all the time. And I just didn't think it would be taken seriously if we talked about scoundrels. Although if I were to redo it, I could almost sort of heighten this aspect. What you're always doing, if you're just sort of doing it word for word and trying to be faithful, you end up with wallpaper. I think that you have to sort of, you're going to emphasize some parts, the parts that you think are important. You're not going to sacrifice anything, but you are clearly going to put emphasis on certain parts rather than others. For me, the emphasis had to be on sound.
Okay.
Music, I was playing a lot of Verdi while I was translating.
But the Requiem Mass,
Yeah.
maybe?
No. I was actually playing the Ballo Maschera.
Okay.
Like the second act, because third act, so much happens, And I felt like the plot is also structured like an opera. And Manzoni makes many references to opera, sort of quoting even Rossini, saying di 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 piano piano, he starts doing these sort of series of adjectives like that, which are straight out of opera. And so I wanted to bring out that aspect of it.
Now, let me ask you a question, because you just mentioned ziti ziti. I mean, he does use, and I've never seen it before him, two adjectives or two nouns, one following the other, exactly the same word. Bene bene, that sort of thing. How do you translate that?
I try to stick to it. I would say quiet, and argue with my editors about whether we could do that or not. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So it's a balancing act.
So a lot of it is a balancing act.
Yeah, all of it. Yeah.
So there is no straightforward rule. So because somebody compared him to Tolstoy, for example, which I don't like as much as I like Manzoni. Maybe because I don't know Russian, so I can't appreciate it that way. But there is a sense that psychologically, also, not even Dickens, more like Dostoevsky, psychologically, he's far more astute than than Tolstoy is. He
Yeah.
really sort of goes into somebody's motivation. Enough so that you know that this is a complex writer, not a simple one that wants to just write and tell a story. And I found that. So, do you want to discuss?
Yeah, I see that especially in the figure of the nun of Monza.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's a remarkable piece about this woman being forced into the convent. And he takes you step by step into how it happened, how from birth she was destined to become a nun, or even before birth. So he goes a little bit farther, and it has to do with her family. And at the time, you didn't have the sort of division of the estate among the various brothers and sisters equitably as Napoleon brought about. You know, they wanted to keep the estate whole, you know, for the oldest son. And she resists, and she resists as best she can. And there is absolutely no way out up until the moment that she has to accept, you know, being received into the convent of her own free will. So I think that's probably one of the most remarkable portraits of a woman, or of anyone, that I think had been written in literature to that point.
Who was the writer who wrote The Monaca di Monza? So he wrote a novel right after Manzoni.
Really, I didn't. You know.
Oh, isn't there?
I mean, there've been.
I'm sorry?
I read it.
You read it, yes. There is a book called La Monaca di
Yes.
Monza.
A kind of gothic.
Yes.
novel.
Yeah.
And she is dissolute.
Yes.
Yeah,
There's a lot of sex.
what's interesting what happens here in terms of the way Manzoni tells the story. He wrote this novel over a 20-year period. He wrote a first version that was not published. Then he redid it completely and published it in 1827. And that version was longer than this version. And when it came to the nun, he went into much more detail in the earlier version about her evil deeds. And here instead, as a brilliant writer that he was, he stops at that point when he comes to the line in Italian, where she's in the convent, she's got her own little courtyard, and there is a guy whose house abuts her courtyard, Egidio, and he's there in the window checking her out, and she's supposed to ignore him, but at one point she succumbs. And then Manzoni describes that by saying, "E la sventurata di sposa."
That's absolutely beautiful. And I was just told today that apparently every kid in Italy knows that line.
Yes. Because every kid is sventurato, right? Or has felt that way.
But you translated it differently.
Yes.
And so we can discuss that.
Sure.
I told you I was going to ask you this.
No, but I'm ready. It's one of those lines that, first of all, when I read it to Italians, they want to know, how did you translate that line? And I tried it in a million different ways. The issue was, first of all, in the Italian language, you can take an adjective and turn it into a noun just by putting, the definite article in front of it, and they do that very frequently. It doesn't always work. And to do that literally in English, then you tend to say the unhappy one, or in this case, sventurato, or even the word avventura is tough to translate in English. It sort of troubles me. The literal translation would be wretch. I couldn't call her a wretch, because it used to, then you think like Amazing Grace, for example. Or you might think the language of a comic book, for example, which is also what I would have ended up with if I had called scoundrels scoundrels, Quick Draw McGraw and the kind of cartoons I saw as a kid. So I went back and forth, and I think it was just at the very last, handing in my last draft, that I just went with my gut. And I found it had to be a sentence that resonated. It had to be something that stuck in your ear. It had to leave you hanging. And her response leads to a whole series of events, the fact that she does succumb. And so I decided to use the word fateful, because I think the idea of sventurata is that you will meet a bad fate also. So I thought that the concept of fate fit in well, and I put it, at the end of the sentence rather than turning her into, I tried calling it the unfortunate woman gave her reply, and it just, no. And the wretch gave her, no.
What did somebody else translate it as?
To say the wretch.
The wretch. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Wretched.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's an amazing character, I have to say. Let me just look at my notes here. Can one spend a lifetime with this book? You've said that to me.
It's funny, friends of mine have a reading group, and they've been reading a novel by Nadine Gordimer, where a woman only wants to bring that book with him. You know? And I think, yes, everything is in this book. It's an encyclopedia, I think. And I think you could read it again and again and again, and always discover new. I certainly spent almost a lifetime translating it, and finding new things in it every time. So yes, I think so.
You were saying that you spent 10 years at least?
At least 10 years, yeah. I started actually 2004, stopped. And then I realized that I couldn't keep juggling things. The only way I could finish was to pronounce everything else. So I took time off from work, went on residency, did that whole thing. And then the pandemic came, which of course shut everything down, and that's
the best thing for you.
In a way, but it was also, it lent a relevance to this book. One of the other things that makes it so resonant.
Oh my God, yes.
First, I remember when I was living in Italy and they had the AIDS crisis, they started talking about the untori, these figures that supposedly spread AIDS deliberately. Because in this episode about the 1628 and 1630 plague, so the superstitious people claim that people were spreading it. I imagine it being almost like blood splattered on the wall. And so this idea of plague sowers could also be translated as. And certainly with the pandemic, all the Italian newspapers started with headlines saying, that moment they had feared had finally come.
Yeah. No, because for those of you who know the novel well, you cannot read that novel today without thinking of COVID. It's all over the place, and it just begs to be read that way, to be integrated.
And it made me go back to those chapters, and suddenly things that might have seemed distant were very real. He talks about social distancing, for example. Renzo enters the city after it's been struck by the plague, and people are saying, stay 10 steps away from me.
Talking about the plague, there's a moment in which we find that Renzo had it, but survived it. And then we find out that Lucia also had it and survived it. Agnese, was she hit by it, or I can't remember.
Agnese didn't get it.
She didn't get it.
But Perpetua, Antonio Bondio's, and it's funny, Perpetua is the maid of the priest, and she is such a striking figure that whenever you talk about a priest's maid now, you talk about her being Perpetua.
Well, now that's the name that they give to a person who wants to be hired, as a Perpetua.
Yes.
I know.
Yeah.
But the point is that, in essence, it's still there, and it doesn't go away. And so I always felt that the play was really almost a metaphor for us today. And but here's my question: is that Renzo and Lucia get it, but survive it.
Yeah.
Why?
I think it's a tribute to the peasant class almost,
Oh,
that they're
okay.
being robust, that they're being, maybe it has to do with their being virtuous, could be that. This marriage vow sort of, kept them together even when they were apart, even though there was a whole complication of Lucia and her promise, to remain a virgin. But I see it as Manzoni, who grew up in that area, and who was himself a noble, but would not use the noble title count. He would not allow people to call him a count. I think it's a kind of tribute to the peasant class, and to the entrepreneurial class as well. When I look at Renzo, one of the figures that I like the most, there he is, he's an orphan, but very hardworking, and he puts together, a livelihood.
Okay. So essentially, I always thought it was just too neat that both had to survive the plague. I thought one can go.
I mean, in an alternate universe, I would have had Renzo going off with the Monica di Monza,
Okay, fine.
and maybe Lucia with the nameless one. But,
Yeah, Minato is clearly. So is he in love? No, he's not in love with her. He would never dare be in love with her.
No, he suddenly, she is this picture of virtue, and when he sees her crying, already he felt bad about having to do this favor for Don Rodrigo. It just seemed like one thing too many. Like people are always asking me for favors, to kill someone, to kidnap someone. Why? I'm tired of this.
Yeah.
And so I think when he sees her, then he's just overwhelmed by her innocence and vulnerability, which some might be attracted to.
Oh, I see. Some people might be attracted to her virtue.
Yes.
Yes, of course. Maybe. No, it's just that I found that the innominato, for those of, how many of you know the novel? I should not presume. The innominato is a character who's basically a what do you call it? He's a murderer, he's an assassin who suddenly has a conversion and wants to do good and cannot sort of hurt anyone any longer, and basically abandons his first life for a new life. I don't buy it. I mean, it's like Tony Soprano deciding to be good.
I mean, when you're raised Catholic, you are raised in conversion, you know. And one of the great things about the Catholic religion, you could be a sinner your entire life,
Yes.
but if at the last minute you repent, you're in heaven. That's what it is.
According to Dante too. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah. So you're saved. Okay, fine. I'll buy it. Fine.
I mean, in Judaism, do you have conversions?
I don't know. I don't know. People try to convert you when they stop you in the street and ask if you're Jewish.
I get asked that a lot.
You get asked that. I get asked that all the time, and so I always answer by saying, even if I were Jewish, I would tell you no. Just to throw them off and confuse them. No, I don't think we have even a paradise. So we claim we have the kingdom of God, which is only our own. In other words, Jews have the kingdom of God, nobody else does. If you believe in that. Okay, anyway, why am I going there? No, there's so much here. Yeah, the part that I skipped because my recording didn't have it was the conversation about Richelieu, Wallstein, and Olivares.
Yeah.
And maybe you can, because it's a conversation that takes place while they're having lunch at Don Rodrigo's. And that part interested me because another historian mentions it. And so I was asking, did you know what they're talking about? It wasn't clear to me.
You get into, first, you know, it's one of the great scenes in
Yes.
the novel, because you have every class of Italian society. You have, you have the one priest who's coming in, you have Don Rodrigo, you have the lawyer, you have the mayor, you know, you have cousins. I mean, it's a huge variety of people, but what are they debating? They're talking about chivalry. So they start talking about tasso.
Yes.
And whether or not you should shoot the messenger. You know, and that becomes one of their big points of debate. And who would do this and who would do what? And this is a time in history where, in terms of the historical background to the novel, you're having the War of Succession of Mantua, which is basically a proxy war between France and Spain. So Spain, their great minister of state is Count Duke, right, Olivares. And France, you have Richelieu, who actually leads an army into northern Italy in order to take back Casale and Ferrato. So they get immersed then, and it's part of Manzoni's whole critique of the 17th century in a way, not just of the Spanish occupation, but of this obsession with something that was already archaic in that time, you know, chivalry. So they're debating that pretty much.
They're debating that. Okay, fine. No, because it was basically elided in my version, so I was very upset when I.
Yeah, and then the various people debating Wallenstein, the Austrian or the Holy Roman Empire, which is such a strange denomination, a strange name for a nation. But he was the great, what we call the great general, who was actually in the end killed by the king, by the emperor Maximilian.
So this is basically the historian. He's extremely well versed in history, and he's not basically showing off. He's simply history and languages. I mean, he speaks Spanish, he speaks French, Italian is perfect, and of course Latin and Greek are perfect. He's a very educated man who's not just showcasing what he knows. He's just very well ready for this. In other words, it's as if his whole life was leading up to this. And how many versions did he write?
Three basically, but maybe four, you know, because then there's a second version of the first version.
Okay. Long story, okay. And
although there are only two published versions, though. You know, the 1827 version, and then the thing is this, that Manzoni creates modern Italian, but it was not his native language. He was literate in French, and he spoke Lombard dialect. but he was from a family that was very prominent in sort of pushing the preeminence of Milano over Firenze, over Florence. Part of the Levi family, and they were saying, no, I mean, we are equal to the Florentines. He comes from this background, but then in his final version, he goes to Florence with this famous line to rinse, his rags in the waters of the Arno River to make it more Tuscan.
And that's how Italian, basically modern Italian, comes about. It's amazing how a writer can actually redefine a language. I don't know, do you know of any other equivalent like that? I mean, I can't think of anybody.
No, because I think the fact that Italy was fragmented politically for so long and geographically led it to not have a unified literary language. France, was unified relatively early, as well as England as well, and Spain. So no, Italy's, I can't think of other writers, maybe from certain Asian cultures that I'm not familiar with, but when an oral language becomes written, then sort of need for standardization creeps in. But his agenda was also very much a part of Italy becoming a nation in the 19th century. He felt it was necessary. And he sort of clearly felt it was necessary to know Italian history.
Which he does.
And then he used the vehicle of the novel, and then he felt bad, actually. When he wrote about the historical novel, he sort of felt like the novel was not the right vehicle for telling history.
What would be the right vehicle?
History.
Oh, history.
Yeah.
Oh, flat-footed history.
Flat-footed history, yeah.
No, we like it, novelist. Yeah. Okay. No, I'm just, yeah. Let's talk about that one scene that I happen to love a lot, which is, and I mentioned it to you, and it's a scene in which Lucia has made a vow. She was in danger, she felt very scared, and she thought she was going to die, and she made a vow. Let me survive this, and I will remain a virgin for the rest of my life. I will not get married to Renzo. And she decides that. And then there's a moment in which she reflects that. And it's a moment that, if those of you who know Henry James, there's always a moment in which the heroine will basically confront herself and say, what am I doing? Why am I doing it for? What are my motivations in doing this? And I love those scenes. And it's, for me, that particular moment occurs when she is by herself and she is basically thinking. Do you have that scene? I can tell you where it is.
Okay.
Give us a second, because it would be nice to read, because she's, it's on page 394.
Okay, well, starting with that thought.
Yeah, sure, that
okay.
thought, yes.
But that thought too renewed her feeling of shock. She recalled all the circumstances of the vow, the unbearable distress, the little hope she had of being rescued, the fervor of her prayers, and the depth of feeling with which she made that promise, with which she had made that promise. To regret that promise, after benefiting from its grace, seemed sacrilegious and ungrateful, a betrayal of both God and the Virgin Mary. Such an act of treachery would invite new and more terrifying misfortunes from which not even prayer could protect her. And so she hastened to take back that momentary regret.
Right, so she has a regret. But then she finds that the regret is now, she has some regret, clearly, which is brilliant on the part of Manzoni, because how can you make a vow like this when you're in love with a man? And then she finds out that Renzo is away and may never come back. So that fortifies this simple, stupid detail of Renzo being away, sort of fortifies her resolution to stay and continue making that vow. And so she is now straddling two contrary strains in one. And I thought that this was absolutely brilliant. Very few writers know how to do this. And he does it brilliantly, as we've just read. And by the way, the prose is beautiful. In English. No, it's actually brilliant. So I just love when a narrator sort of goes into the mind and sort of unsaddles the whole mind and sort of shows how it's in conflict with itself and finds all kinds of excuses to remain resolute when it's already faced with regrets. And I love that. And the whole novel is like that.
Oh, I'm very moved that you're pointing that out. out, because there are so many different parts to this. First of all, you have me thinking that Henry James might have read this,
He could have, yeah.
I think there's a lot to the narrative technique, and it makes me rethink the plot as, what the high point then becomes when Lorenzo finally discovers her in really what is like the ninth circle of hell, if we want, I think, in the Lazzaretto, which is where the plague victims were taken, and it's filled with grotesque figures. It's terrifying. And he finds her. It's very reminiscent of Dante in many ways, also of like Dante when he meets Beatrice at the top of the hill of Purgatory, and it's this moment of truth. And the challenge then, the plot then, is how to break her resolve. And it is only through the intercession then of Fra Cristoforo, who had tried to save their marriage in the first place, in the very beginning, that he is able to convince her that she had made this vow under duress and that she had not given consideration to the first vow that she had to Renzo and to him, actually.
Does that work though? Does that? It felt like casuistry. And it was good. I mean, it worked for me. I wanted them to get married, and I wanted to be released from that vow, so fine. But it felt like
it's another conversion.
Anyway, so I had a lot of fun. I listened to the novel this summer. I bike a lot, and I listened to the whole thing and it's amazing. It's very well done, and I enjoyed it tremendously because I hadn't read it in many years, and it was wonderful. So thank you for this, and maybe we can open this for questions.
I confirm that we study Promessi Sposi second year of il liceo and also in fifth year. So it's a lot. I think that the reason why it is so relevant yet, it's because Manzoni was able to capture the flaws of the Italians. And there it's still true today. So we have the Miquan, Don Abbondio, or I don't know, La Zecca Garbugli. I'm dying to know what you did with the names.
What did you call
like,
it?
Yes.
Please explain that.
So, Zecca Garbugli, it's a sort of invented name because it means both precise and confusing at the same time. And he's the lawyer that Renzo goes to trying to find a solution to, how can I finally, get this, overlord off my back? And Zecca Garbugli completely confuses the situation and sends him running. But I sort of puzzled over the name, and nicknames are tricky. But then I came across a sentence of all people, Antonin Scalia, the late Supreme Court justice, whose father was a translator and a professor of Italian, by the way, which explains, I think, part of his gift. And when he was dismissing, people that disagreed with him in that sweeping way that he had, he said, "Oh, that's a bunch of argle-bargle." And so I called him Argle-Bargle, which, it's not Italian, but I think it captures sort of that notion of nonsense, and it's a double. It has the right number of syllables and the right sound to it. So.
Perfect. I didn't check that. Okay. I know it. Let's go to the next.
First off, I wanted to say that you're my favorite interpreter in New York. I'm always happy when you're interpreting at an event. The title, how did you decide, it's the novel I Promessi Sposi has been translated as The Betrothed as far as I know. So how did you choose to use the title we all know? Did you consider other possibilities?
I know. Many have asked me about this, and they say, "Oh, the promise." I mean, I think that there's, I don't know are you Italian?
No.
Okay, no, but I mean, just if the Italians will forgive me, I think there's a kind of obsession about this novel and about needing to be literal about every damn word, And I think they put him on an altar, and I think you have to sort of mess with it a little bit. But the only link maybe between me doing this work and a potential American readership was the title. Like, people have seen, I can remember even when I was in high school, the high school librarian had a list of the great books we should read. There was The Betrothed. And I think people know the title, they don't even know the name Manzoni. For a while, in trying to sort of, expose who Manzoni was, I'd say, oh, well, the Verdi Requiem was written for him, and then what's the Verdi Requiem, So I think it was really just for the recognition value, and I really couldn't think of a better title, because I've seen people say, oh, the promise of fidelity, or, it's odd though, even in other languages you have Les Fiancés in French, Die Verlobten in German, it's kind of, and Italians don't like the word betrothed for some reason. I think it's rare, but you find it on wedding invitations all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More questions?
Thank you. I'm curious about Manzoni, the historian. So I found it really interesting how he has these documents or supposed documents. Was he actually like combing through archives, or are these made up documents?
Yes, I mean, even before this, he'd written two tragedies, the Adelchi and the Conte di Carmagnola. And he has had, as a preface to these plays, which were really closet dramas, they're not easy to perform. He did significant historical research, and he gave the whole historical background. Here, I mean, he has an invented opening paragraph, supposedly from the manuscript, which, traditionally goes back to Don Quixote, right? This idea that I'm not making the story up, I found an old manuscript and this is what it says. I'm just rewriting it. But he quotes extensively from the documents. When he talks about le gride, these decrees, but what's funny is the way that he quotes them. I mean, they were tough to do. I was lucky to have a lawyer friend Italian lawyer friend whose professor had written a whole book about these gride and what they meant. And so first I had to kind of unravel them and figure out what they were saying, and then to re-ravel them, because he quotes them in this very particular way to make fun of them as well, and to say how contradictory they were, and how the fact that they kept coming out showed how useless they were in terms of suppressing the bravi, these thugs that were running around, beating up on people. So yeah, he did lots of historical research for this, and lots of dictionary work, and
It's an amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an encyclopedia of a thing, and no wonder then that it doesn't
disappear. It just won't disappear. And Italians can be sometimes, what's the word, retentive? Yes, they won't let go of it the way they do with Dante, which is great. And I think it's wonderful that people still read it. And so everybody reads it in the Liceo until today, which is great.
Yeah, but funny, in terms of his reputation here, like Dante is well known. Maybe it's because poets are more interested in translated poetry, but Manzoni, just hasn't had quite the same treatment. And I think, like I say, some of it's hard to explain. But I also think that when the Italians talk about Manzoni, when they talk about Italian Romanticism, they tend to talk about it as an isolated phenomenon, and they exclude it from the whole flow of European literary history.
They do that, and that's it's damages the whole reputation of Manzoni, because when you exclude them, it's terrible. I mean, I just think of two books in Italy that have, I mean, Il Giovane Holden, which is sort of not a good book. So why is it, or the Gente di Dublino, which also is a book that has sort of left an impact on Italian language. And those are, that's what Italians did, but then they have Manzoni, and that never goes. I mean, you can have Cassola, Lampedusa, and all those, and they'll go away. But Manzoni stays, which is actually amazing, because he is, I hate to say it, he is the best writer. And even if he weren't, there's so many arguments to convince you that you cannot let go of it.
What's funny is I've done some Italian press, and I'm hearing that Italians are picking up the novel again. Because of the attention that's being paid to it in America. Because I'm saying people have to read it as adults and not as kids, because there's so much to it.
Well, I always assign another book that I always assign to my students, Ethan Frome. And they've all read it. They've read it in high school, and they know the snow. And then basically they assume that everybody's sort of eating sort of, what do you call it? There's not Cracker Jacks, what do you call those things that are made of beef jerkies? That's what I think of when No, it's actually an extremely courtly book that basically camouflages as people, sort of lumberjacks, basically.
Yeah.
And that's not what it is. But everybody has read it as kids, and that's when they read it in liceo, and maybe they should read it as adults, because they'll find a totally different book.
Yeah. I mean, when I've looked at some of the editions that they had, when I was looking for a good commentary, which I really needed, I realized why so many Italians disliked it. Because the footnotes were just sermons. They weren't really explaining what you needed to know. They were almost like saying, here, Manzoni is being ironic. I mean, and then half the page is taken up by the footnotes. I mean, it just sort of, again, it embalms the book rather than.
I think that's a good word, embalming. All right. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask a personal question?
Sure.
You said that it took you 10 years to complete the job.
Yeah.
Have you ever felt desperate for not being able to complete the job?
No, I would pick up a little book. I sort of wanted my name to stay in circulation, so I would like translate something else here and there, make an appearance so people would know I was alive. But I don't regret that, because with each thing that I did, I think it made me a better translator, gave me a bigger arsenal. One of the surprises, I've done subtitles for films, for Adrian sitting there. And in doing subtitles, you have to have them, carry so much information in just in 2 or 3 words. And so I think that made me also go back and look at dialogue differently. So everything that I did, Manzoni uses so many different styles in this novel that I think by doing a variety of things while I was doing this, it made me a little bit more equipped then to translate in different ways the different parts of the novel. So.
But I could see how somebody might become discouraged and need a conversion.
I'm taking you to church after.
I'm sure I would have to do that.
Did you read the Manzoni in English or in Italian first?
In Italian, yeah. But I didn't read it. Although I lived in Como and Milano, and I knew all about it. Especially in Como, you see various characters. All the ferry boats are named after a character, pizzerias. But I read it when I went to graduate school, and I studied Italian in graduate school. In 3 different courses, we had to read it.
Somebody back there.
Congratulations, Michael. I wanted to ask, sometimes, especially with Romance languages, we use certain phrases and words that in English may not make sense. So when you encounter challenges like this, what were the tools, or how was your approach to come up with a successful translation of this piece?
I wouldn't say it was individual words. I mean, sometimes some of the sentences were very long, and you can get lost. Actually, when I was translating, I was doing a lot of it longhand, with a fountain pen. It was nice, trying to sort of get in the mood, not by candlelight, because that would be terrible for my eyes. But I sometimes would get lost in long sentences, and then, thanks to my editors, really, I could go back over them and say, take another look. And I'd like, oh yeah. And so with that, like I said, some sentences would go on for an entire page, and you could really lose your place. So that was the bigger challenge, I think, for me.
Hi, Michael. As many Italians, also I read this book when I was 16 years old, and certainly I haven't looked at it for the following 30 years. But I still remember.
The math.
I still remember some expressions because Manzoni did invent the Italian language, and so there are some expressions that became everyday expressions that every Italian knows. For example, when he compares Don Abbondio to a vase of clay that travels alongside vases made of iron, that actually became an expression that in Italy we used to describe the country itself. Italy as a vase made of clay that travels alongside vases made of iron. So because we are very vulnerable as a
I
country.
think I said a clay pot among iron kettles, I think.
Yes.
No.
But I was just wondering if you think that the fact that this book is not very well known abroad depends on the fact that it's very heavy on religion. In fact, we might say that one of the characters of the book is providence, God's providence. And so Andrea was saying that certain things, are not very believable. For example, Renzo and Lucia that, both survived the plague. And perhaps this very heavy presence of religion makes this novel less modern. For example, in comparison to Tolstoy or other writers of, that came later on.
But Tolstoy was very religious, I mean, he really...
But the presence of it
No, it's funny.
in the novels.
That is something that Italians have said, that they said maybe it's a Catholic element. And I heard one Italian poet once say, Americans can't understand the Divine Comedy, the Betrothed, the Promessi Sposi, because they don't know about divine providence. And I said, excuse me. I said, I grew up near Providence. I mean, this is a country which is obsessed with religion, look at all these people that thought that they would find paradise on earth by coming to the United States and creating these sort of semi-religious settlements. So I have heard that, and I think it might bother maybe some Anglo-Saxon critics, but I'm not convinced of that. And I think there's so much more to it than the religious aspect. I think that Italians, or certainly Italian teachers, overemphasize this theme of divine providence. The word only occurs like 4 or 5 times in the novel, first of all.
I
The
agree.
word that occurs most frequently is confusione, by which he means chaos. It's one of the brilliant things that Manzoni does among his innovations is describing the chaos of a crowd. When he talks about these bread riots,
Yes.
when he starts, and he suddenly leaps into the present tense then and starts using jagged sentences. But I mean, I think he is the first to describe the confusion of the crowd, So I just think that there's been too much of an emphasis, perhaps,
Yes,
on
we are taught a lot about providence.
they shove it down your throats,
Yes,
really.
yes.
I mean, you can kill an author that way. And I think, oh no,
Just think for a second, and the thought just came to me as I was listening to your question. What if a French writer had written I Promessi Sposi? Can you imagine Renzo sort of staying pure and Lucia making a vow and sticking to it? Absolutely not. But that's a different
Although
issue.
France has more Catholic holidays than Italy.
It does?
Yeah. When I spent some time, I was surprised at how Catholic France was, And again, many more religious holidays in Italy or in the United States.
Oh, good. Okay. See, I'm
Learn
getting
something
it.
new every day.
Yeah. Any more questions?
There's one in the back.
Oh, thank you.
The book was written twice in Italian, right? First and then second time in different dialect. Did you rely on one or the other more in your translation?
Did I read the other versions?
Did you rely on one version or the other?
Yeah, no, I used the final version.
The second one?
Because it would just the final version. I mean, I think to do the earlier versions would have been good for an academic audience, maybe, but it would have been pointless. I mean, considering that this is his final word. Italy is a country very interested in philology, and finding the original, going to the origins of things, but finding the correct edition of something, which is an issue in translation sometimes. If you're translating from the wrong text, you make a mistake. But here I thought it was important to just stick to his final version. But to know something about the earlier version helped, as in that great sentence, "E la sventurata mi spose,"
So it goes on in that particular
Yeah.
version. I didn't know that. I wonder what she said.
I'll give it to you.
Okay, fine.
Wait, any more? Last
And one final thing, there is also an audiobook. I haven't listened to it yet myself.
Is it
There
out?
is an audiobook, right? Is it out? Yes. And I really wanted to thank my editors for being here. They really helped make this happen, and sort of bring this And for me, one of the most moving parts was just actually opening it up and seeing this part of the book, because when I was in high school, I would read the modern library classics, and to see that there's one with my name on it is an immense privilege.
Let's please give another round of applause. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being here, for filling the room so wonderfully tonight.